Okay, just going to do a run through now of the blueprints. First one is that supporting the special weapon, or the static cannon, as it's called in the game. The weapon is initiated by pressing the S key, and the first thing it does is actually checks a boolean to see whether it is allowed to discharge the static cannon. The weapon is a timer thing, and once it's used it has a 30-second recharge time, and this is essentially a check to see whether it is charged or still recharging. If it's still recharging, it calls this little function, and set incoming message is just used within the game to update messages that come up on the head-up display. So you send the message that you want sent, and then it will display that, and then after a few seconds make it disappear. Assuming that the gun is charged, it then does a check to see how many power boosts the player has and whether it has the 10 required in order to perform a firing of the static cannon. If it doesn't, a head-up display message is sent telling the player that they haven't got enough power boosts yet. And if it does, it then goes into the first of a few functions that do the mechanics of firing on an enemy. The first of these, find static target, which I'll get onto shortly, essentially just looks at what enemy ships are in its line of fire, and if it acquires one, it sends back a reference to that target, and if not, it says that no targets were found, which generates another head-up display. If it's got a target, it then uses that new target into another function called possess static target. Possession basically gets around some of the complexities of trying to put all the contagion code and normal attack code inside a single unit. So essentially what it does is it finds the target and replaces that target with a possessed version of itself. Once it has that, it then fires off the sound of the cannon going off and calls the function fire static cannon, and that function basically does the creation of the particle beam that runs between the player ship and the enemy ship. Once all that's done, we have a bit of housekeeping. We need to set static in use to true so that the weapon cannot be fired, or so that contagion will start happening, and there is then an event that cuts off contagion after 15 seconds. We deduct the number of power boosts from the player's stockpile, and we set the allow static charge, which was our first flag, to false, and fire up an event that reactivates the static gun after 30 seconds has elapsed. If we go into the underlying functions now, the first of those was to find the static target, and you'll notice throughout these there's quite a lot of printing to the log file. They disappear once it's all done, but now it lets me make sure it's doing what I think it's meant to be doing. What this process does is basically go through and look at what actors are out there, whether in this case bombers, and if there's no bombers, drones. It gets a list of all of the actors in that class, makes sure that there are actually some, and if there are, it basically goes through a loop that makes sure that the unit is still valid, and that's mainly because you may have shot it before it's had time to possess it. It then goes through and finds out where that particular actor is and whether it is in the range allowable for a possession to take place, and if it does, it then returns to you a reference to that target and sets the flag that a target has been found. So in this instance, so basically it will either return you a reference to an enemy bomber and tell you that it's found a target, a reference to an enemy drone and tell you it's found a target, or it'll tell you it couldn't find a target, which in the original event graph will just end up with another head-up display saying there was nothing in my line of sight. Having found the target, this then gets passed into the next function which will possess that target, and it, after setting that up, again finds out what sort of target that was. As I said earlier, we're going to replace the original unit with a possessed version, so I need to know which of two courses or three courses of action I'm going to do. If, again, for some reason in the milliseconds that have occurred, it's actually been lost, then it'll just return out of the process without firing. But if it exists, it'll go through and find out where the actor is, create the possessed version of that unit at that point and destroy the original actor. It will then go and return back to the original event graph code the reference to that new actor that it's going to fire at, or in this earlier case, if it hadn't actually been able to do that, it would get a null reference, and if what it's possessed for some reason turned out to be something I didn't know about, it would also have an exit condition there. So at this point we have a unit, we've possessed it, and the last of the functions basically creates the particle beam by firing the cannon. So again, what we have is the location of the target we're aiming for, our location as the player. We calculate a path that's going to connect through, and we go through the process of spawning our beam. We set its target point being the enemy ship, the source point being ourselves, and once we have all of that, we can add the particle system, which creates, in this case, the solid red beam that runs between the player and the target ship.